Good morning, everyone. I'd like first to introduce myself. My name is Ruth Ginio, and I'm a historian of French colonialism in West Africa. I'm not doing any history of any mandates, so I'm really grateful for the invitation to Professor Billie Melman and Professor Liat Kozma, and I think that just like Billie mentioned, this is a very important subject for a conference, and I always thought about the British Mandate history as something that should not be studied on its own or only in relation to Palestine and the history of Israel, but also in maybe not comparative, either comparative or connected way to other histories of mandates, and maybe even not only mandates, maybe territories that are supposedly under direct colonial rules, because sometimes the difference is not that great, especially, I think, in the B and C mandates of Africa. So I will introduce each speaker before he or she comes here, because there's no, they will not be able to sit there, but it's good because maybe they have PowerPoints. So the first speaker is Professor Michael D. Callahan. He's a professor of history and Francis Wilson Thompson Professor of Leadership Studies at Kettering University. He is author of Mandates and Empire, the League of Nations in Africa, 1914 to 1931, and A Sacred Trust, the International Oversight of Colonial Rule in Historical Perspective. His latest book, The League of Nations, International Terrorism and British Foreign Policy, 1934 to 1938, was published in 2018. He's currently conducting research for a book on the history of the League of Nations, Britain, and chemical warfare, 1919 to 1940. Please, Professor Callahan.
Thank you very much for inviting me here today. The title of my paper is Glass Houses and Empire, the British and French Mandates in Africa, 1914 to 1946. The First World War transformed Europe and Africa. The global conflict not only caused widespread suffering and sparked a far-reaching debate on the purpose and future of imperialism in the post-war world. Many, including the American President Woodrow Wilson, rejected any straightforward annexations. After much acrimonious debate, he forced Great Britain and France to administer the conquered German African Empire as mandates within a framework of international accountability. According to Article 22 of the League of Nations Covenant, the tutelage of the peoples of these territories formed a sacred trust of civilization. Wilson argued that this mandate system meant that old-fashioned imperialism was over and the mandatory powers were now trustees responsible in the forum of the world at the bar of the League of Nations. He also insisted that, quote, there is no more annexation, there is no more land grabbing, there is no more extension of sovereignty. It is an absolute revolution in the way in which international affairs are treated, and it is all in the covenant of the League of Nations. While the League of Nations mandate system was not an absolute revolution in international affairs, it was not a return to the pre-war imperial order either. Both Britain and France accepted, albeit often reluctantly, incompletely, and under political pressure, meaningful restrictions on their imperial rule and developed policies for their mandated territories that were more internationally oriented than those in the rest of their empires in tropical Africa. Despite its many flaws and failures, international oversight helped to define the legitimacy and limits of colonial control in Africa. Mandates represented a genuine internationalization and reformation of colonialism and had long-term economic, political, and cultural consequences for both the colonized and colonizers within the British and French mandated territories in Africa. Britain received the most mandates, including German East Africa, half of Togo, and a small portion of Cameroon. France obtained the other half of Togo and the rest of Cameroon. For the first time, an international organization, through a Permanent Mandates Commission, the PMC, had the authority to examine annual reports and question representatives concerning the colonial government's promises to carry out the specific terms of the mandate, as well as uphold the broader principles of Article 22. The PMC was never a harsh critic of imperialism bent on the destruction of the European overseas empires. Rather, it was dedicated to a progressive agenda of gradual reform and pragmatic paternalism. Geneva discovered that the threat of criticism was far more powerful than actual condemnation, since, as one British colonial official wrote in late 1919, mandates were glass houses exposed to those who could amuse themselves by throwing stones at our mandated houses whenever they are annoyed with us or they want something from us. The creation of the mandate system had an immediate impact on the former German colonies. None of these possessions were legally a colony or protectorate. A mandate constituted a new category. This fact caused one colonial office official to complain that a mandated country might aptly be described as no man's land. Taking its inspiration from Lake Tanganyika, London renamed German East Africa the Tanganyika Territory in order to avoid the terms colony or protectorate altogether. In West Africa, Britain was forced to halt plans to absorb its half of Togo into neighboring Gold Coast and parts of Cameroon into Nigeria. Pointed questions from the PMC concerning apparent annexation pressed London to adopt the names Togoland under British Mandate and the Cameroons under British Mandate instead. Similarly, despite years of work based on the assumption in Paris that its half of Togo would become part of the colonial federation of French West Africa, while Cameroon would form the new center of French Equatorial Africa, the colonial ministry in 1921 transformed the ex-German colonies into two special territories with autonomous administrations, independent of either federation. In explaining the new policy, Paris told local colonial officials that possible accusations of annexation from both the Americans and the League of Nations made separate and autonomous administrations in the mandated territories necessary. The specific terms of the mandate, tied to the threat of public criticism, compelled British and French colonial officials to alter, reconsider, or abandon a number of colonial policies in their mandated territories. For example, since the mandate stipulated that Britain permit the entry of missionaries and foreign nationals from any member of the League, the governor of Tanganyika did not have the same powers as other colonial administrators had to reject undesirable groups or former enemies if they came from places such as Switzerland, Czechoslovakia, Alsace-Lorraine, the Free City of Danzig, or Ethiopia. In addition, questions from the PMC about France's promises under the terms of the mandate to limit forced labor and promote the material well-being of Africans resulted in a tax rate in the French mandates that was only half that in every colony in French West Africa, a decline in unpaid labor in Cameroon, only 4 days of required annual labor in Togo rather than the standard 10 in every French colony, the permission to use African languages in private schools, and increased African participation in Togo's local government. The PMC's concerns about the partition of the Kingdom of Rwanda also convinced the British government to transfer to Belgian control a region comprising nearly 500,000 Africans in order to bring greater unity to the kingdom. The terms of the mandate also insisted on the protection of African land rights. These stipulations prompted the Colonial Office in London to take the unusual step of drafting special land legislation for Tanganyika and compelling the governor to enact it. Designed to please the League by distinguishing the mandated territory from the neighboring British Crown colony of Kenya that had a large white population, it actively discouraged European settlement in Tanganyika. The British alienated less than 2% of the total land of the territory for whites. The Colonial Office even rejected an offer from the royal family to buy property in the mandate since, quote, the special position of Tanganyika territory as a mandate country, it is not a colony, nor part of the British Empire, makes it very questionable whether the acquisition of property there by a British prince would be politically advantageous. On occasion, overt criticism from the League drove both Britain and France to adopt policies that were even more restrained and internationally oriented than the mandate text required. In 1923, the PMC complained that while international law forbid Africans who lived in the British mandated territories from joining any military unit that might serve outside of the mandate, the League wanted to prevent Britain from recruiting Africans from Togo, Cameroon, and Tanganyika, even if they crossed the border into a neighboring British colony or protectorate to enlist. British colonial officials were furious with the proposal, and the conservative government led by Stanley Baldwin immediately and formally rejected it. Nonetheless, the League continued to press. In early 1924, a new Labour government, eager to show support for the mandate system and avoid accusations of militarism, decided to dismiss the objections of the permanent officials in the Colonial Office, War Office, and Admiralty, and informed Geneva that Britain would adopt the PMC's suggestion. Britain surrendered to the League, shocked and angered the French. However, in late 1924, Paris decided that it was best to copy Britain and satisfy the League by placing tighter limits on military recruitment in Togo and Cameroon. The decision to further restrict military recruitment in the British and French mandates had a direct impact on the economic, political, and cultural lives of Africans. In Tanganyika, the British dramatically decreased the size of the African Defense Force by nearly 1,000 men. In French Cameroon, officials cut the military staff of French officers by 80%, and the number of African soldiers by 1/4. In French Togo, the cost of the military and police were kept to a tiny 6% of the total expenditures of the territory. More importantly, local French colonial officials refused to institute conscription. This meant that Africans from Togo and Cameroon were not forced into military service, unlike the nearly 10,000 Africans conscripted each year from French West Africa and the 1,000 drawn from French Equatorial Africa. The consequences of these policies were real, but mixed. Service in colonial armies was often exploitative and dangerous, but it offered comparatively high pay and a chance to exercise a form of state-sanctioned power that many colonized peoples did not have. But Germany's entry into the League of Nations in 1926 had other far-reaching consequences for the mandated territories in Africa. Not only did Germany regain access to its former colonies, but a German national joined the PMC. Protected by the terms of the mandate, a large influx of German settlers and missionaries into Tanganyika and the British Cameroons altered local economic and political conditions. By the 1930s, Germans were the largest group of European settlers in Tanganyika. During the interwar period, sisal became Tanganyika's chief export crop, and by 1934, Germans owned more sisal estates than any other non-African group. German missionaries recovered most of their lost property and returned to operate dozens of schools, educating thousands of African students. In southern British Cameroons, Germans repurchased most of their old cocoa plantations, and by 1926 accounted for 60% of the Europeans in the mandate and soon employed over 13,000 African migrant laborers. One particularly striking example of the far-reaching implications of the mandate system concerned British East Africa. Throughout the 1920s, many government officials demanded granting greater regional control to white settlers, while others argued for extending protections to Africans. However, Britain's own law officers concluded in 1931 that the Labour government's plans for a form of closer union between Tanganyika and neighboring Kenya and Uganda violated the mandate. They also noted that Germany was entitled to pursue international litigation before the Permanent Court of International Justice and, if successful, could compel Britain to undo any political union that included the mandated territory. This view forced the colonial secretary to insist that Tanganyika was, quote, not British territory and will not become so, unquote, and all plans for political integration of British East Africa were abandoned. While this prevented the creation of a unified East African dominion dominated by white settlers, it also dashed Labour's hopes for a single East African British protectorate that would have erased nearly 1,000 miles of artificial colonial partitions and consolidated the communities and resources into a large multi-ethnic state founded on the principles of trusteeship underlying the mandate system. The mandate system also gave colonized people a new means for embarrassing and resisting colonial rule. As early as 1919, the German-trained elite among the powerful Douala of the French portion of Cameroon sent a petition, written in German, to the delegates at the Paris Peace Conference requesting self-determination. In Tanganyika, Asian merchants successfully used India's membership in the League and the threat of sending petitions to Geneva to pressure the British to end certain forms of racial discrimination within the mandated territory. French colonial officials were routinely embarrassed and became increasingly paranoid about a series of printed leaflets and petitions addressed to the League from a group of Africans calling itself the Bund de Deutsch Togelander, who demanded self-determination and accused the mandatory power of oppression and torture. In December 1929, the Douala hired a lawyer in Paris to help compose a long and detailed petition, once again written in German, to demand transforming the mandated territory into a self-governing international territory under League control and administered by several powers, including Germany, Norway, China, and the United States. The economic and political crises of the 1930s, however, tested both the League and international trusteeship. But despite the onset of the global economic depression, the commercial equality clauses of the mandate meant that the British and French mandated territories could not grant tariff benefits to imported goods from the mandatory powers. While many German settlers in Tanganyika received financial support from the German government, international law prohibited Britain from providing similar government funds only for British settlers. In fact, after complaints from the German government officials, Tanganyika had to abandon its requirements that schools teach all subjects in English in order to receive government grants. Since Germany's withdrawal from the League in 1933 was not effective under League's rules and for another 2 years, authorities in Tanganyika could not ban the creation of a local Nazi party and a Hitler Youth organization. British colonial and military officials also decided it was illegal to put any armed British vessel on Lake Tanganyika, build any naval fortifications at Dar es Salaam, or contribute to the costs of naval defenses in neighboring Kenya. But it was Ethiopia's membership in the League that put uniquely penetrating pressures on British colonial rule. In the early 1930s, a group of Ethiopians living in Tanganyika hired a lawyer in order to object to being classed as natives under the law of Tanganyika. The acting governor argued that, quote, "I have no hesitation in saying that it is extremely important that Abyssinians, who are, in point of fact, members of the African race, should be subjected to the same control as other Africans in such matters as the possession of firearms and the consumption and sale of intoxicating liquor." The Ethiopians' legal challenge sparked a contentious debate within the Colonial Office, which decided to ask the former Chief Justice of Tanganyika for his opinion. He was convinced, however, quote, "Abyssinians, being nationals of a state member of the League of Nations, must be regarded as duly civilized and treated on the same basis as British nationals." He warned that the Permanent Court of International Justice would probably construe the provisions of the mandate liberally in favor of Ethiopia. As far as he was concerned, quote, "Whatever rights could be demanded on appeal to the court by the French government on behalf of a Frenchman could be demanded on appeal to the court by the Abyssinian government on behalf of an Abyssinian, however wild and untamed he might be." After much discussion, London asked the local government to adopt a special ordinance that would satisfy the Ethiopians and eliminate any risk of an appeal to the League of Nations. Like Britain, France too had to continue to confront the international status of the mandated territories in the 1930s. During the Popular Front government, Paris took particular pains not only to make both Togo and Cameroon showcases of France's civilizing mission, but to demonstrate the government's support for the League. While most colonial budgets were cut, both Cameroon and Togo received additional special funds to support their campaigns to fight sleeping sickness, something Geneva openly praised. Since many Africans from Cameroon worked in the neighboring Spanish colony of Fernando Po, local French authorities successfully pressed Spanish officials into adopting labor regulations that conformed with the French mandate. Criticism from the PMC also prevented France from including the ports of both mandated territories in the Navy's defense plans. Further, Paris insisted that Africans in the two mandates could only serve in the military and police forces stationed within the mandated territories. Now, none of this is to say that the British and French mandates in Africa were an unalloyed success. In many respects, the mandate system simply provided the mandatory powers with a more internationally sanctioned means for continuing to exploit, demean, and dominate the peoples under their supposed tutelage. Both routinely failed in their obligation to ensure adequate labor conditions for Africans and to prevent forms of forced labor in their mandated territories. While the British insisted that Tanganyika was a black man's country, some of the best agricultural lands still went to whites anyway. Both mandatory powers also avoided giving Africans meaningful posts within the colonial administration. Despite the professed promotion of the free exercise of all forms of worship within the mandated territories, neither the British or French accepted more than a handful of stateless Jewish refugees from Nazi Germany. The official reports to the League, in many cases, did not reflect actual practice or conditions on the ground. Anglo-French reaction to Italy's invasion of Ethiopia in 1936 and Britain's willingness to discuss Germany's colonial demands with Hitler exposed much of the hypocrisy inherent in the sacred trust in British and French imperial rule in Africa. Nonetheless, for those British and French colonial officials responsible for the day-to-day administration of the mandated territories in Africa, the League system continued to function despite these many flaws. The British colonial secretary made it clear in 1938 that Britain was to be as Caesar's wife in upholding the terms of the mandates, particularly in view of the critical examination to which our record as a colonial power is now being subjected. At the same time, the French colonial ministry rebuffed calls in France to annex their two mandated territories. Even after Britain and France had declared war on Germany and the British settlers in Tanganyika demanded abolishing the mandate, London refused. The Colonial Office angrily pointed out that, quote, "We have agreed with the French not to abstain from the forthcoming meeting of the Permanent Mandates Commission on the grounds that if we did so, it would be interpreted as an abandonment of the mandate system." Neither mandatory power wanted to do anything, quote, "which might be interpreted by enemy or neutral propaganda as showing any intention to evade our mandatory obligations." The General Assembly of the League of Nations held its last meeting in 1946 and formally ended the mandate system. All of the British and French mandates in Africa became trust territories under the supervision of the United Nations. The UN Charter declared that those who assumed the administration of these territories accepted as a sacred trust the obligation to promote the well-being of the inhabitants of these territories. Much like the League Covenant, the UN Charter confirmed that international law, international organization, and the principles of trusteeship remain closely intertwined and intrinsic to the post-war global order. Few British and French colonial officials could pretend that the mandate system had not altered the imperial relationship in Africa. Often for differing reasons, both imperial powers understood that mandates were not colonies. Mandates meant less militarism, more commercial equality, a greater emphasis on the interests of local populations, and an end to the extension of national sovereignty over colonized peoples. The mandate system was not only a permanent reminder of the condemnation of old-fashioned pre-war imperialism, but it gave the mandatory powers a practical means for carrying out their reforms while attempting to repair their imperial reputations. At the same time, these glass houses made it harder for Britain and France to hide the persistent contradictions, unresolved dilemmas, and mounting failures of their colonial rule in Africa from the increasingly critical gaze of the outside world. Thank you very much.